Hello and welcome to the next in the video lessons. The usual disclaimer regarding the fact that we do not focus on specific evidence here. You must find that in your own time. We're focusing on the analysis, so don't just take this as what you need to know for this topic. We are looking at the first of the three crises. There are three crises that you are expected to know for the exam. Any one of them might come up between 1910 and 1914. Well, roughly 1910 1914. The first is the rise of industrial unrest and whether Britain was close to revolution in this period. The next two are the suffragettes and votes for women and the Irish question. So this particular topic focuses on two key questions. Number one, how close was Britain to revolution before World War I in the period 1910 to 1914, and why was there this upsurge in politicized striking and industrial unrest? So we're going to confront the first question, which is why did it happen first, and then we'll move on to whether it was truly revolutionary. So as you can see in the charts here, the amount of days lost due to strikes massively spikes between the periods 1909 and 1914. Now, in reality, what happens is it spikes at the very highest at 40 million days lost in 1912, and then starts dropping off fairly quickly after that point, 1913 going to 1914. Now, in retrospect, it was a benefit of hindsight. We obviously know there's no revolution and there's no violence. But the reasons for this strike and the reasons for this a huge increase in industrial unrest was a real issue at the time and created a lot of concern. And quite logically, for some people, it was a harbinger of the revolution, which has been brewing in other nations, finally coming to England. So there are a number of reasons why the number of strikes increased, and very few of them have actually got anything to do with any socialism or any radicalism. Okay, in reality, the forces which shape the strikes are largely around economic change and the role and actions of the bosses of the unions and bosses of the businesses. Okay, and essentially what happens is the equation changes. What had kept the peace previously was an relative economic prosperity, which meant that everyone was doing relatively well and therefore didn't need to strike. To some extent, union bosses were prepared to be moderate, and bosses to some extent were okay to compromise. In addition, unions were into some sort of control after the Osborne judgments and Taft Vale cases. So what happens is those restraints on strikes shift away. And therefore, what happens is there's an upsurge of violence. So perhaps when you think about this, you should view it more as an example of the restraints towards industrial unrest coming away, as opposed to things pushing industrial unrest, although it's largely semantic. So first things first, there has been a simmering tension between unions and employers since about the 1890s, when employers started to take more unified and more aggressive moves, as we mentioned earlier, against unions, employing black-leg labour, forming employee federations, using government forces and private security, etc., etc. And so the employers, and to some extent the government, particularly conservative members of government, like in the civil service rather than the ministries, have always resisted the idea of unions, and I resisted the aims that there would be unions, and I've always seen it as their purpose to get rid of it. So, and that's always been there. And so you can argue that actually there's been a long-term tension, a lack of acceptance of unionism, which then feeds into this resistance and therefore keenness to use black-leg labour and refuse to negotiate with unions. On top of that as well, there is a long-term structural change in the economy. British exports are suffering. There's an economic politics lesson with that very start, which has that in, but the structural employments are losing business to foreign rivals. As this happens, businesses increasingly feel their margins squeezed, and therefore unable to justify paying workers as much, or having to cut corners and making work longer with more pay, etc., etc. The effects on this is essentially squeezing the conditions and pay of workers. If you are going to try and do more with less, logically your workers are going to suffer to some extent. On top of that, there is, in the short term, around this period, 1909, 1910 onwards, there is a rise in inflation. Price wages go up. Now, in reality, if price wages go up, even if wages stay the same or even improve a little bit as they were, it can feel to many people like actually they're losing out. So say if the price of food goes up by 20%, but your wages only go up by 5%. In relative terms, in real terms, your real wages have decreased, and that will therefore lead to workers feeling that they need to get paid more, and therefore leads to a lot of agitation and strikes within unions. So the economic changes are both long-term in terms of the structural weakness in British industry, meaning it's starting to get out-competed, and the short-term price rises, which is putting problems. Additionally, the government has not done anything really on either side. Okay. What this means is the unions, if they want a minimum wage, if they want fair working conditions, they cannot rely on the government to get that for them. So they have to do it themselves. And the only way they get that working conditions, minimum wage for themselves is by striking. So you can argue that the failure of government to create a workable social safety net, a workable relationship between workers and industry is in part responsible for the fact that unions then go rogue and do it themselves. It's also worth pointing out, even though it's not on there, is there's an argument that part of it is the fact that the government actually is too nice to unions by reversing Taff-Ale and by reversing the Osborne judgment. They actually strengthen the unions, and it has been argued that that's from that position of strength, from the fact that they now can strike, and they can now fund political parties, and they can now ensure they always get funded, etc., etc. Because of that, they are now more emboldened and more powerful and more likely to use force. The jury's out on that one, but that is one you could deploy. Additionally, you can say that as employers get more and more and more and more annoyed and hostile towards unions, there is less keenness to negotiate and more keenness to use black-leg labour. Lockouts is which is basically a reverse strike, where you say you're not allowed in to accept a pay cut, and therefore these people don't get paid. There is blacklisting of union members, which means if you're part of a union, a list is put around, your name's on it, and you'll never be employed in any business which has access to that blacklist. That's designed to sort of pressure people not to get involved in unions. And at the same time, trade unions, more than any time in their history, are increasing in size. The amount of people joining them gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and this feeds into their sense of confidence, how well funded they are, how organised they are, and also we see them then forming federations, working better together in the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, and essentially being far more confident and competent and well organised, which naturally, if you think about it, will lead to them being more active and more willing to go into strike action, etc. And the final factor, which is a minor one, but your sources will certainly reference, is there is also a rise in some areas of radicals. Radicals who want to use trade unionism as step one as part of a wider socio-economic change. Some are socialists, some are other different breakdown groups which I'll get into, but there's an argument that these men who have more concerns about destroying the economic and political system agitate the unions into doing more aggressive strikes and more violent strikes. Now, while there is elements of this being true, ultimately this doesn't really get borne out by the evidence. But we'll look at that more when it comes to the failure of revolution. So going back to that, to summarise, the number of strikes therefore are increasing due to long-term economic factors and putting pressure, being combined with short-term economic pressures, which lead to a almost joint sense of panic and desire for wage increases. This happens at a time where unions are more confident, and also empowered to do more, at the same time that employers are less keen to negotiate, and with a background of people agitating for strikes. In reality, the most likely answer falls into the category of a combination of the first five, the rise of radicals being far more minor. So let's focus on the second question, which is slightly more pressing and slightly more difficult, which is the idea of how close was Britain to revolution. Now, the best way to approach this question is think, had Britain been genuinely revolutionary, had Britain had a revolution, what would have happened? What do you need for a genuinely revolutionary situation? So essentially, this is what you need. We'll ignore the top one for now. You need a revolutionary force. You need people organising a widespread across the country organisation which spreads the idea of revolution, organises the revolution, trains arms and coordinates the revolution. You also need, outside of that force who will do the organising and fighting, you need sympathy amongst the wider working class. Doesn't necessarily have to be working class, but in this 20th century it probably should be the working class. You need a widespread sympathy for some change. The working classes agree. They might not be part of the Revolutionary Party, but when the revolution comes, they are happy to see it and they will support it. Otherwise, you just have revolutions trying to trigger a revolution, but no one follows, and they just get very quickly isolated and destroyed by the security services. What you also need is a sense amongst the society that this socio-economic political situation is not good. I.e., you do not have communism if people are broadly happy with capitalism and democracy. If people think democracy is deeply and fundamentally flawed, then people might start considering changes. So if people are looking at the political and economic system and saying this is fundamentally wrong, this is fundamentally unfair, we need to destroy this, then you will be able to inspire people to do a genuine revolutionary response. So with that background, where you've got a sympathetic masses who will carry the revolution, you have people who genuinely believe that there should be a fundamentally different society, political and or economic structure, and therefore again will follow the ideas. And you add to that the idea that people are genuinely supportive of a revolutionary support force which is well organised and able to carry it through, then you have the bare basics. But if you have this revolutionary situation, but the government deliberately tries to avoid a situation escalating by deliberately being reasonable, by deliberately avoiding using force, then it is hard to ignite the masses into violence. Whereas if you have these people who dislike the system, a well-organised revolutionary situation, and party which has lots of connections and able to mobilise and effectively organise revolution, and you have a government which is cruel, disproportionate in its use of violence to control, it is then therefore a far more revolutionary situation. And therefore all you need is a trigger, an economic, political, whatever event, to really start the crisis. Now what we will see is when you look at this diagram, in reality, or this list, in reality, very few of these are actually true. And so while you have strikes and while you have radicals, most of these things do not happen, are not there. So how can it translate into a revolutionary situation? So let's talk about the radicals first. A lot will be made of the radicals, and in the source question there will be definitely quotes from a radical saying something radical. Okay, essentially, syndicalism comes to Britain at the end of the 1800s and starts making a home in slightly more intensely working class areas, particularly areas around where there is very tight-knit communities with a real distrust of outsiders, even from the same working class socio-economic group. So we're talking the miners of Wales, the shipbuilders of Glasgow, etc. Syndicalism is a combination of socialism and anarchism. It comes from Proudhon and Kropotkin, primarily more Proudhon, and it's the idea that essentially all control all of the control of business, industry and the government should be given to workers who form collectives. This is very different to communism, for example, the Russian version of communism, so Leninism, which says there needs to be a big state to help organize the ideal socialist republic. This says that any authority is bad, and therefore what workers should do is they should choose if they want to be part of a collective. If they do, they work with the collective, they work and they share goods, they help each other, but if they decide not to, they don't have to. And one of their leaders is a guy called Thomas Mann. Now in reality, he is actually arrested and convicted of conspiracy to mutiny. He tells the troops in a newspaper article not to shoot at the fellow working class soldiers. Now this is perhaps disproportionately arrested, not on the orders of the government, but on the orders of the local magistrates. It's a very important distinction. And quite rightly, a lot of people say, well, is that really incitement to mutiny, or is this just a politically motivated arrest and imprisonment by what is essentially an aristocratic local magistrate? And public pressure really piles on the government, who then quite relatively willingly, because it will help diffuse the situation, get him released. In Ireland, there's a guy called James Larkin who does very similar things. And you can argue there is the beginnings of a truly revolutionary organisation with the ISIL, or the International Industrial Syndicalist Education League, which was founded by Thomas Mann in 1910, with the intention of teaching workers about syndicalism as the first step to the revolution. You need to educate people about what syndicalism is in order to have a syndicalist revolution. Now, in reality, while there are radicals, there are always radicals everywhere. Okay? The existence of radicals does not equal revolution. The existence of radicals of a well-organised party equals revolution. But the ISIL is actually, as you can see, only lasts 3 years, very poorly organised, very poorly attended, doesn't really go beyond vague lecturing about what syndicalism is. It does not translate into genuine conspiracy to do a revolution. And so while it is definitely a collection of political outsiders and people who have, on their individual basis, anti-government views, it does not transform into a genuinely revolutionary environment and a genuine revolutionary force. It at no point makes any plans in any meaningful way to do a revolution. It doesn't organise guns, it doesn't organise strategy, it does not hide defectors, it doesn't, etc., etc. It doesn't do all the things you need for a revolutionary force to do it. So we cannot really describe the radicals as an organised revolutionary force. Okay, and the radicals themselves, although they are very popular in their areas which dislike outsiders, are very, very tight-knit, got a real sense of us and them. So we're talking the dock workers on the banks of the Clyde, the South Wales miners are relatively supportive of syndicalism, and they do tend to believe it quite seriously. But beyond that, across the rest of the trade union and labour movement, there is very, very little support for syndicalism. And this really comes down to what we mentioned about British socialism. British socialism is fundamentally moderate. It is not really, it's very distrustful of over-intellectualism. This isn't helped by the fact that pretty much all of the radical socialists are middle-class people who don't really connect with the working classes, which only reinforces this image that ideology is for the preserve of the self-indulgent who don't understand what life is like at the coalface, as it were. A hobby almost. Champagne socialism, etc., etc., etc. So therefore, the organisation, although it's very popular in these tiny areas, across the country has very little role. And particularly, Thomas Mann is not a famous figure, James Larkin is not a famous figure across the UK, certainly has no organisational capacity to organise revolution across the UK. Arguably, if he wanted, there could be some resistance in these places, but even in these places, there's no real attempts to take on the state. So while people believe in syndicalism, it's not mobilised to any revolutionary dimension. So there's summary about the radicals, and there will be quotes about it, either from magistrates who are terrified of the radicals or from the radicals themselves saying something radical, is they talk a big game, and they certainly talk a lot about a revolution, etc., etc., and they do have some followings in certain areas, but largely they are not popular enough, well known enough, good enough leaders to actually turn that into revolution. Hence the reason that the Industrial Syndicalist Education League fails and does not do anything meaningful to organise the revolution. So the radicals, therefore, are completely lacking. So if we go back to our list of what we need for a genuine revolutionary situation, we already lack a organised and widespread revolutionary force. Yes, we have the radicals, but as we can see, they are limited, they aren't popular in most circles, they are badly organised, and they don't really have a sense of direction. And on top of that, as you can see, and we'll go on to again, the working classes in general, although they are not happy with their situation, do not want to end capitalism and democracy. They do not want revolutionary change. They want change, but not revolutionary change. They want the sort of change a trade union brings, strike action, and a liberal government which gives moderate social reform. Oh yeah, it'd be great if there'd be more, but let's step by step. The risking house and home, life and limb is not on the high priority for wannabe revolutionaries at this point. So the radicals really, really don't present a real revolutionary threat, and that's one of the key points to get across, is in the absence of a genuinely revolutionary force which is organised enough to sort of topple the government across the UK, how the hell can you have a revolution? Hello. Oh. So therefore, if there's an absence of the radicals, what about the government? Because in theory, if the government is violent, oppressive, brutal and disproportionately unfair towards the upper classes in the response to the peaceful strikes, in theory you could have a genuinely radical situation, because what that will do is that will polarize the public, that will make the workers increasingly hostile to the government and respond with violence and create a revolutionary situation. Because sometimes you can have an organic revolutionary situation where the government aggravates the workers who are peaceful, not revolutionary, into being revolutionary by shooting them in the streets, beating them, showing unfairness in terms of legal proceedings towards the employers, and therefore almost forcing the workers into the revolutionary corner. Now, in theory, that would happen, and that could do it. In reality, though, the Liberal government, David Lloyd George, essentially is unwilling to trigger that environment. There's two big reasons. They are sensible in that they realise if they try and do that, if they use brutal levels of force, it will just be counterproductive. It will just embolden the trade unionists, make them more aggressive, make them more radical. And number two, the Liberals need the working class votes, so they cannot annoy them by sending troops and to shoot them in the street and be seen as deeply unfair towards the working classes. So therefore the government is largely conciliatory towards the workers. They generally, apart from a couple of isolated cases which, when you look into it, are as much to do with the local magistrates who are right-wing and far less strategic in their mindset, overreacting, than it is central government. And very often central government have to tell off the local magistrates for being so radical and so violent in response to what is essentially only a strike. And so what they do, in fact, is they actually very often refuse to side with the employers or to intervene at all. And they also try and make attempts to help the two sides to come to negotiations and try and cause, ameliorate, sort of make less damaging the underlying issues which really cause these strikes, poor pay and poor working conditions, by improving the conditions of people in the legislation. So not only the government trying to avoid direct conflicts and violence by being deliberately softly catchy monkey approach and being generally reasonable towards dealing with the unionists and being almost painstakingly keen to show that they are taking neither side. They are also trying to stop this underlying economic push which is creating the rise of strikes in the first place. So, for example, there's the 1909 Trade Board Act, and then which by 1913 the trade boards reported that there should be an increase of low-paid workers in industries which are sweated, such as chain making, by 50%. By raising that salary, they are less likely to strike, there's less likely to be violence, etc., etc. Miners get the minimum wage by the government making an act telling a private company how much they should pay their workers by law, which is a big deal, in 1912. So the government, if they were violent and they deliberately cracked down on miners and they deliberately beat up the people who were striking, they could alienate many people and that could create a revolutionary situation. But that is studiously avoided by their deliberate attempt to avoid controversy and avoid violence. Which basically means that they would choose to, rather than rebel against a capitalistic democratic system, they would contribute and be part of the welfare state. So in this case, under the 1911 National Insurance Act, certain approved societies, building societies essentially, would have the right to help give welfare, and many unions took up that right to help their members give them welfare. Now, if they were truly rebelling against the economic system led by democratic capitalism, why would they be part of it? And in fact, of the 60 in 1914, 60 of the 63 unions asked to fund the Labour Party agreed to fund it, which shows that clearly the unions were supportive of the idea that parliamentary democracy was the way forward. If they believed that parliamentary democracy was dead and that the only way forward was revolution, why would they pay money for the Labour Party? And so in reality, the unions, if we look at them, break it down, the masses outside of these areas are not convinced. And even in these areas, when the economic situation improves, they improve. It is not an accident that the industrial, syndicalist, etc. education league fails in 1913, because the economy picks up in 1913, and therefore people start drifting away from it and seeing syndicalism less as a viable option. The unions stick within the system and tend to be suspicious of syndicalism. Although they are in theory, much like many in the Labour Party, left-wing in rhetoric, they tend not to be massively ideological and in fact very suspicious of the ideology espoused by syndicalists. And finally, the Labour Party itself at no point had any meaningful flirting with syndicalism. MacDonald realised that if his party was seen as being associated with this much more radical, more difficult to control idea, this will only hurt this desperately important task to make the party look more legitimate, more sensible, more grown up, more parliamentary. So he went out of his way to make sure that there was no contacts between the Labour Party and syndicalism. Indeed, people were expelled on the basis of this. And so therefore, the Labour Party, the only natural party in which syndicalism could perhaps infiltrate and use in order to get popular support, also is not there. So syndicalism and radicalism fails to proliferate the masses, fails to proliferate the unions, fails to proliferate in the political party of the Labour Party. Therefore, there is really nowhere it develops. So in reality, if we look at our summary, what does Britain need for a revolution? A trigger crisis? Well, you can argue that perhaps one or two of Tony Polly massacre or the violence in Liverpool might be a trigger, but in reality they are so isolated events, and they are so even mild by their relative standard, and it's quite easy to argue that they were not part of a deliberate ploy to destroy unionism and working class rights. So in reality there is no major trigger. But even if there was major triggers, in reality there is no organised, widespread revolutionary force to turn it into a revolutionary environment. Yes, there are syndicalists, but they are far too divided, far too geographically limited, far too disorganised, far too weak, and far too unpopular with the vast majority of the people. Likewise, the average working class person and their unions and their political party do not want revolution. They are generally happy-ish with the political and economic situation. They don't love the capitalist system as it is, but they would rather change the democratic capitalist system to be fairer to them than completely get rid of it. Better the devil you know. And therefore there's not massively an appetite to getting rid of it. And this is therefore underpinning that you can speak all the agitation you want. You can have the most effective syndicalists you want. You can have reasonable rates of violence you want. But it won't turn revolutionary if people don't believe in making that revolutionary change. And it's just not there. And you can argue again, the government ultimately plays a very conciliatory line, deliberately tries to make sure it looks neutral, deliberately tries to avoid violence, and even when there is violence precipitated by the government, it is usually isolated, it is usually an overreaction of a local leader, as opposed to, and I need to find specific examples of this, local leader rather than central government. Indeed, central government sometimes ignored their instructions to keep the violence to a minimum. So in reality, the government does not do any coercive response in any meaningful numbers to push people towards revolution. So overall, we can see therefore that although there is an upsurge in strikes due to a combination of employers being unreasonable, unions being bolder, and economic factors pushing people into wanting to do strike action, this is not a revolutionary situation. It is temporary, and in reality by 1913 it passes. And although strikes will still be a thing, the spikes we see in 1911, 1912 do not replicate themselves. Why does that stop? Well, simply the economy improves. In 1913, 1914, the amount of inflation reduces, the amount of people who are available to get work increases, and therefore people generally are less annoyed and less feeling like they have to strike because they feel like their jobs or their incomes are under pressure. Similarly, the government is continuing to conciliate, make relationships between the various groups, and has throughout this period. 1911 we've already talked about national insurance, 1912 we talked about the miners' minimum wage, 1913 the trades boards we're talking about. They are making legislation which is alleviating and supporting workers. And so therefore the trigger which is causing some of this, so miners stop striking once they get their minimum wage, etc. The chain makers stop striking once they get their 50% pay increase. Therefore, there is less of a need to strike if the things which are making you strike are being helped by the government, or people at least believe the government will deal with it, as opposed to having to force to through violence, etc. As well as this, employers' federations increasingly realise that they cannot crush unionism, they cannot destroy unionism, and they're going to have to coexist with unionism. And therefore, employers' federations tend to stop being so combative, and they start to break down a little bit, and individual bosses drift in order just to make some profit to negotiating with unions. And as soon as the bosses begin to negotiate, we see a lot more tensions being resolved, and more importantly, we see fewer strikes. And even therefore, if there's hatred between bosses and union representatives, there are no strikes because they come to some sort of deal. And finally, the big thing which really caps it off, but in reality it is pretty much finished by the time this starts, is World War One. World War One calls for a patriotic everyone pulling together, and at least temporarily this is reflected in a very patriotic approach of the unions and reduction in the amount of strikes, although it never gets to zero. Obviously that pattern does not go all the way through the war, but that's the subject of a different lesson. So thank you for listening. That was a relatively quick summary of the labour tension. What we really want to get across is it's the economy stupid, that's what the strikes increase, and it's not revolutionary. They are not simply the circumstances to enable there to be a revolutionary situation. Apart from that, thank you very much, and I will see you next, which I'm not even going to try and speculate what we're going to look at next.